A while back, I reviewed a retro game called Little Princess by ChampionSoft, who would later become AliceSoft, creator of the Rance series of games which have become a staple on this channel. The game kinda sucked, though it did have some charm, and it was interesting to see the earliest iterations of Kintaro and Miki, who would eventually become important figures in the actual Rance series. Well, in 1988, Little Princess received a direct sequel called Little Vampire, and while it's still pretty rough, it's a substantial improvement in pretty much every regard. So let's take a quick look. To quickly recap Little Princess, it was a text input adventure game with about 15 minutes of content, not counting whatever time you spend just blindly flailing around trying to figure out what to do. It had all the problems of the old text input adventures, such as needing to input the exact correct command or it wouldn't understand you, required steps that require pure guesswork to trigger, and pretty messy design overall. Despite being a 15-minute game, if I didn't have access to a walkthrough, I probably wouldn't have finished it. The story is as simple as it gets, where Kintaro and Miki get isekai'd by Dracula, who then proceeds to kidnap Miki. And the story from there is just Kintaro tracking Dracula down, killing him, and saving Miki. And while there were a few funny moments, there really wasn't enough for me to have anything of substance to say. To sum it all up, the game kinda sucked. So how does its direct sequel, Little Vampire, hold up? But before that, I'm just going to answer a quick question that I know some of you will be having. The reason you're seeing two cursors in this footage is because I use an upscaler for old games and visual novels because it's more enjoyable for me and gets better footage for my videos. But for whatever reason, OBS captures both the real and projected positions of the cursor, even though I only see the one when I'm actually playing. I got that question on my Kichipo Rance video, and I don't know why it happens or how to fix it, so we're just going to have to deal with it. Trust me, it's better than zooming in on the original resolution. So unlike Little Princess, Little Vampire is not in fact a text input game. Rather, the adventure is done via menus, with the first menu listing actions and the second listing the people, places, and things that are potential targets of your selected action. So for example, to go to the park, you select Move, then Park. So right away, this is a significant quality of life improvement over the previous game. In Little Princess, you had to guess what terms the game was programmed to recognize, and there'd often be certain interactions that aren't obvious. This would have made the experience extremely frustrating were I not using a walkthrough. That being said, if you've been looking at the screen, you'll see that there are a lot of options available to you, and it can sometimes be a bit overwhelming. Once you get the hang of the flow of the game, it becomes a lot easier. For example, a quick sweep of talking to everyone in the area is often recommended to make easy progress, and it can give hints on what to do next. And many of the options just give you flavor text or a joke. It's also worth mentioning that the puzzles and progress flags are a lot less prone to bullshit than in Little Princess. In Little Princess, there were often a bunch of strange and unintuitive things you needed to do to progress, like looking at a pile of rocks 4 separate times to find the 4 gems you'll need later. Or how you needed to use the Talk Cute input on an NPC, which I wouldn't have even known was a thing without a walkthrough. But in Little Vampire, since it's all menu-based, there's no chance of options being hidden like that, and there's also much more of a sense of direction. Occasionally, NPCs will straight up tell you who you should talk to. Many of the little quests you'll have to go on are restricted to a specific area, so even if the way forward isn't obvious, you at least don't have to scour the entire game trying to find that one thing you need to do. And there are ways to get little hints about your current objective or next steps. That being said, it's still far from perfect in that regard. At one point you discover a new location by searching the previous location, at which point Miki will hear a river flowing, which you can then explore. However, she'll only hear the river if you've made a completely arbitrary amount of progress. That means that if you did that particular action early on, you might reasonably assume that there was nothing there and not think to try it again. Many of the items you'll need to progress are in places that don't really make a whole lot of sense. For example, at one point you need to get rid of a yokai that had been haunting a shepherd. The yokai turns out to be reasonably friendly and will leave voluntarily if you can find her a pair of glasses. Those glasses happen to be in a pile of junk in a hut near Dracula's castle, which is several zones away from the yokai. There really isn't any way to figure this out on your own without blind guesswork. And the puzzles only get harder the further into the game you go. Some of the things you have to do in the final act are very intricate with zero room for error, and I'm not sure I would have figured it out on my own without just brute forcing it. And doing so would be time consuming because there's a lot of ways to fuck yourself over. So in Little Vampire, it's surprisingly easy to die and to softlock yourself. The first act is mostly pretty safe, but in the third act especially, there are a lot of things that are literally just instant death. Read this one book? Death. Don't have certain items in your possession at certain times? Death. Do have certain items at certain times? Death. Don't give a certain character a certain item? Death. Give that character that specific item but too soon? Death. Make a wrong move in a maze that isn't actually displayed on screen? Death. Make one wrong move in any of the combat encounters? Death. If you're not using a walkthrough, you are almost certainly going to die numerous times, and it can be frustrating, especially since you can't always save. There are certain places where you can save, and there is a certain one-use item that lets you save anywhere, but when you die, you're probably losing a bit of progress. But beyond death, there are also soft locks. The big one is not having certain items you need to progress, but being past the point where you can obtain them. For story reasons, you'll no longer be able to access the shops in town after the first act, so you need to get money and buy the items you need before you move on to the second act. And the game will literally tell you in the transition, I hope you have all the items you need because you're in trouble if not. And you have to remember that the game doesn't function like a JRPG where you can just grind money to buy everything up. Like other text-based adventure games of that era, and the point-and-click games that started popping up around the same time as Little Vampire, the design philosophy of the game is for everything to be an interconnecting puzzle with money being one component of that. A limited component, to be precise. So getting the money to buy things is one step in figuring everything out, and just so you know, there are ways to lock yourself out of potential money, which can soft lock you if you screw up too badly. And you won't actually need everything that you can possibly buy, though if you play optimally, you will have more money than is strictly necessary to beat the game, so there is some wiggle room there. And on top of the money issue, there are a number of times where you can lose items. Sometimes there will be events that'll just straight up take shit from you, and you better hope it wasn't something you need. There are some times where you have to give items to NPCs to make them like you. If you give them a critical item, that's a soft lock and you won't even know it. And no, without a walkthrough, you won't have any definitive way of knowing exactly which items will be needed in the future. It's just very easy to throw away things that are important, and I'm personally not a fan of games where it's easy to accidentally soft lock yourself. While Little Vampire on a gameplay level is definitely a significant improvement over Little Princess, and you can definitely reasonably beat it if you play meticulously and make liberal use of the saves you have available, it's still a pretty frustrating game to play blind. Granted, this was released well before I was even born, so it may just be a thing that people my age won't resonate with. But with a walkthrough, I was able to appreciate what it had, and I can imagine someone playing the game at the time and having fun with it. Though much like Little Princess, the 6,800 yen price tag was an absolute scam even without adjusting for inflation. Thankfully, AliceSoft has since made it freeware, so that's no longer an issue, but I would have been very upset if I had to drop AAA cash on a game like this. But since the game is in fact free now, I can't link it for TOS reasons, but you can find it on the translation project page of the AliceSoft wiki. While the game itself isn't pornographic, the page with the download link also contains links to games that very much are pornographic, so I'm not risking it. There's nothing stopping me from appreciating Little Vampire's strengths. And one of those strengths, particularly compared to Little Princess, is that there is so much more visual charm. Since making my Little Princess video, I've learned that a big reason that the game was so visually janky and why Kentaro had tits is that almost all the visuals were recycled assets that maybe had some recoloring done to them. Kentaro's portrait specifically was one used for a female character in a different game, so knowing that, I can understand why it felt just wrong to me. When a game is just a collection of reused assets cobbled together, nothing feels like it really belongs. And interestingly, that's exactly the same reason I think that games using AI assets often feel off-putting as well. The technology just isn't quite good enough to make the generated images feel right. But fortunately, this isn't an issue with Little Vampire, and as a result, the game has a lot of charm. Spoiler warning from here on out, by the way. The plot's pretty straightforward, so don't worry too much, but if you'd rather go in blind, now's the time to dip out. Not only are the environments actually tailored to the story rather than the other way around, but the game is so dense with artwork compared to Little Princess. Every character, including minor side characters, get full-on close-up portraits. You can tell that Championsoft were starting to lean into their signature wacky aesthetic appeal. You've got this baker ghost, because why not? Some of the monsters and obstacles you come across are grotesque and just fucking weird, like this huge eye thing. Look at these weird-ass fucking sheep. Some of the environments, particularly in the final act, were these surreal horror-inspired set pieces. And did I mention that there are actual proper CGs in this game? They're not quite the same as what you'd see in a modern-day visual novel, but it's great to see so many visual depictions of the events that are happening. We can see the what and not just the who and where. The characters and their motivations feel so much more real when you can actually see them in action. Like this scene where Miki is starting to transform into a little vampire and is clearly very upset by it. It hits so much harder because we can see her crying and trying to turn away from Kentaro. It's adorable, it's sad, and it just wouldn't have the same impact if we couldn't see it for ourselves. I was so much more invested in this game than Little Princess, and I think the visual improvements and the bevy of custom artwork were a major contributing factor to that. Oh, and I have to point out the little portraits on the side of the screen. Older AliceSoft games tended to have this same general style of UI picture frame that would serve kinda like a decoration for the actual game. and most of the time they were static and unchanging. This is mostly true for Little Vampire, but one thing that does change is the little portrait of Miki. It'll actually change depending on her mood. When she's given a box of candy, she beams. When she's upset, she cries. If you decide to make Kentaro beat the shit out of her, yes, domestic violence is an option in this game. Kentaro and Miki were basically prototypes for Rance and Syl. For the next few minutes, she'll have an absolutely adorable angry portrait. I genuinely love how this game looks. There's just something about AliceSoft's style, no matter who is actually doing the art. It has a great blend of silliness and charm alongside the occasional serious moment, and it's just an experience. And I can't possibly do it justice in a video like this. But enough about that. As many of you will know by now, this is an ads video, so I gotta talk about the writing. To recap what I said about Little Princess, for those of you who didn't watch that video, which is probably a lot of you, that video didn't do so well. It had a few funny moments, but overall, the writing fucking sucked. I hated saying it because writing was old AliceSoft's strength, but it's true. So how about Little Vampire? It's better, at least. The plot is still very simple, but it's a lot more fleshed out than in Little Princess. Before the game even starts, it gives you a brief recap of the previous game where Dracula isekais Miki and Kentaro goes after her, kills Dracula, and saves the day. So you don't even need to play Little Princess if you don't want to. And honestly, I still say that's probably worth checking out with a walkthrough if you're a Rance fan, if only to see some of that series' roots. Little Vampire deals with the immediate aftermath, with the goal at the start being to find a way back to Japan. Not Rance Japan, real Japan. As they're exploring the area and learning more about the world, they meet an alcoholic hermit who teaches them a bit about the history surrounding Dracula. As it turns out, Dracula is not a name, but a title for the vampire who lords over the monsters. Male vampires are called Dracula, and female vampires are called Little Princess, with there generally only being one active Dracula or Little Princess at a time. Vampires have a lifespan of 600 years, and generally, the current vampire starts corrupting and training the next starting at age 400, and this Dracula chose Miki as his successor. Despite their previous victory, Miki slowly starts to turn into a vampire. Kentaro may have killed Dracula, but he was too late to stop him from infecting Miki. Despite the fact that Miki is an adorable little softie, most of the locals turn on her, and now the two have to figure out their next steps with a lot less help than before. Miki eventually gets captured, again, this time by one of Dracula's servants, so Kentaro once again has to find her. As he's figuring out what he needs to do, the alcoholic hermit tells him that Miki has been taken to a magical tower that after 3 days can turn anybody evil. Also, there's conveniently a machine that can open up a dimensional portal there as well. Some miscellaneous quest shit happens, and Kentaro manages to find a fruit that basically acts as a vampire vaccine, and with the help of some magical stuff he obtained, he makes his way to the tower, past the magical defenses, and finally reaches the top. Miki is there, still adorable but newly deadly. She's gone all vampy in training and doesn't seem to even recognize Kentaro. They fight for a bit, and Kentaro realizes that the little creature that's been instructing her is also brainwashing her, so he kills it and Miki goes back to normal. He gives her the fruit, stopping her transformation. Then the two find the dimensional portal and return home. The end. So once again, I don't have all that much to say about the baseline plot. There's definitely more to it than in Little Princess, but it's still ultimately very formulaic at its core. It's actually pretty frustrating for me as a media analyst because with a story so simple, there just isn't anything for me to latch onto for a discussion. I mean, all I can really say is that it's fine, it's functional, it does what it needs to do, but nothing more. But honestly, the experience of Little Vampire is less about the overarching narrative and more about the moment-to-moment bits. As this was made by the company that would eventually become AliceSoft, it doesn't take itself all that seriously most of the time, and a lot of the little side quests you're forced to go on are just kinda goofy and silly. I already mentioned the alcoholic hermit. He's supposed to be the wise man on the top of the mountain, but you have to bribe him with sake to get him to tell you anything useful. The mystical old fortune teller turns out to be a fraud, but you do end up finding the real fortune teller, who's a little girl. It's Arky, by the way. She appears in several of the Rance games, and she is just wonderful. And just like in Rance, you bribe her with candy. Remember that big-ass eye monster I talked about earlier? You defeat it with magical eye drops. In the actions menu, there are a few that are a bit out of place, namely hit and eat. Most of the time, these don't do anything useful, but there will be some kind of funny flavor text, not unlike many of the early Rance games. For example, if you try to eat the girl running the pharmacy, she'll be rather surprised that you're a cannibal. You can also hit Miki. This moderately annoys her for a short time. If you want an extra save point, you can use a consumable item, the squeaky hammer. To save, Kentaro will bash himself in the head with it, knocking himself out. It's just very silly and very AliceSoft. It's the kind of thing that really needs to be experienced. But the story does drop a lot of the humor in the third act. Kentaro and Miki are separated, so there's none of their usual banter, and the tower that Kentaro needs to ascend is again partly inspired by horror. And he also meets the spirit of Dracula's previous choice of apprentice, who is tragically trapped but is willing to offer what little help she can. There's honestly not all that much I can say besides this section of the game is actually played straight. It actually takes itself seriously until the threat is averted and the pair are reunited. Unfortunately, I don't think the overall writing is good enough or deep enough for that to have been a good decision. It goes from being a charming, goofy adventure game to one that's just very bland. Eventually the company would end up figuring out how to make that work, and the Rance games from 3 onwards would all have surprisingly powerful emotional moments despite Rance being 10 times as stupid and goofy as Little Vampire. Seriously, I still think about that one scene at the end of Rance 4. If you know, you know. But at this point in ChampionSoft's lifespan, they just don't have it yet, and that's a shame. I think they would have been much better off if they kept up the lighthearted tone for the entire game. I'm not saying to lower the stakes or anything, but they should have been a bit more willing to have fun with the moment-to-moment bits. So overall, how is Little Vampire? It's leaps and bounds better than Little Princess, and thankfully it is viable to beat it without a walkthrough, though I once again state that I recommend using a walkthrough. Far too many pitfalls for my tastes. While it is a short game, about an hour long not counting the extra time figuring out the puzzles, it's much longer than Little Princess's 15 minutes of content. And what you're in for as far as the experience goes is a charming retro adventure game with some jokes that may make you exhale slightly harder than usual. And Rance fans will recognize a handful of the characters that show up, and I personally think it's fascinating how this version of Kentaro and Miki acted almost as the first draft of Rance and Syl. Kentaro's dickishness would be cranked up to 11 and we get Rance. Miki's kind and demure nature would be turned up to 11, add a bit of Stockholm Syndrome, and we've got Syl. The Kentaro and Miki that show up in the Rance games are similar but different characters than how they are in Little Vampire, so it's cool to see that. It's like being able to see the notes an author took before they started writing their magnum opus. This game definitely has its flaws, and it does trend towards the bland side, but it's a pretty good time all things considered. If you're a Rance fan or just like old school adventure games, I'd say give it a go. It's free, so why not? But if it seems like pulling teeth to you, you can safely skip it. Thanks for watching. Big thank you to my members, especially my top tier supporters, Bulk Squat Thrust and President Irina Vladimirovna Putina. Members got to see this video a few days early, so if that's something that interests you, you can join them for as little as $1 a month. I got some good stuff coming up. As some of you will know, I've been working on a big Mushoku Tensei video. It's nowhere near done yet, but progress is definitely being made. And also expect a video about a neat Western eroge that's a spin-off of an idol game of all things. It's surprisingly good, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Like, I actually considered putting this video on hold to start scripting that video, but I got a hold of myself. Aside from that, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more, and leave your thoughts in the comments. I do actually read them. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Play the electro swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more.